Born in the Dutch East Indies in 1890 to a rich colonial family, Anthony spent his early childhood dreaming of flight. Soon he and his family would return to the Netherlands, and in particular to the city of Haarlem. After a short and largely unsuccessful academic career, though some mechanical aptitude was recognized early on, it was finally terminated in a mutual agreement between himself and his headmaster. Immediately afterwards, reveling in his newfound freedom, Anthony began to devise his first invention. He enlisted the help of friends, and later aviation colleague Fritz Kramer. The result was an explosion-proof tire. It marked the advent of an engineering prodigy. Persuading his father to fund a trip to Germany, Anthony's mind was already moving in a new direction. Peter Alting, Fokker's historian.
The first school he visited wasn't good at all in Anthony's opinion. So after a few days he left for another school where, as he was told, he could also be taught about flying and building aeroplanes. That was his main reason for going to Germany. He wanted to be in aviation. As a matter of fact, he had never seen an airplane flying before in his life, but somehow he wanted to be in it, in aviation.
Armed with this blind but potent dream, Anthony, after a first abortive attempt at flight, set out on his own. A failed prototype, which couldn't lift itself from the ground, was his first tangible result, the Spider. Anthony's delight was total when the Spider achieved a few hops. In the second Spider, he achieved sustained flight for the first time, enabling him to obtain his pilot's license. Already he was becoming a minor celebrity. The third version would become the most significant. Created with the help of boat builder and part-time aviator Jacob Goerdiger, and with further money sent from the Netherlands by his father, it was a more sophisticated aeroplane, capable of complicated aerial maneuvers. In 1911, he took it to Haarlem for a flight over his hometown, an event he himself would relive years afterwards. The public reaction was spontaneous and euphoric, summed up in this description by an onlooker.
As time goes by, you get to know all the celebrities in aviation, but this Haarlemmer was unknown amongst the big names. But my word, what a fuss and noise it caused when that pretty little aeroplane, the Spin, flew over the city, so quietly, serenely, and majestically. From every nook and cranny, people appeared to watch this miracle, and a miracle it really was. The trams stopped, the kitchen maids let the steaks burn, and the sick people in the hospitals crawled to the windows to watch him. So safe and secure, turning so beautifully and flying so peacefully, the bird-like aeroplane flew over the town and the market. It gracefully circled the St. Barbara. I saw elderly people with tears in their eyes because they had witnessed this miracle. And then there was the pride that it was one of our citizens up there, high in the sky. I can't begin to describe the public's enthusiasm. Fokker lives in all our hearts.
I should say the most important aspect was that not only everybody in Haarlem had seen Anthony flying, but his father had seen him flying, because his father had never seen him flying before. And that somehow convinced his father that Anthony was on the right track.
Money from his father was now more forthcoming, and after his triumph, he returned to Germany, and in particular Johannisthal, near Berlin. It was here, the mecca of German aviation, that he was to found his first company, Fokker Aviation Limited. But 1911 was a difficult time for aviation, and expected orders just didn't materialize. Fritz Kramer came from the Netherlands to rejoin his old partner and ease the situation by buying an aeroplane and by becoming Anthony's chief pilot, sometimes giving up to 38 lessons per day in the attempt to keep the struggling company solvent. It was the Dutch government who bought the first of Anthony's aircraft, ordering a military version of the Spider designated M1. Its extra seat and enclosed fuselage was ideal for pilot training. For the time being, however, the company's fortunes were sporadic. Herman Fokker Sr.'s faith in the possible success of his son as an aviator began to wane. Dear boy, You excel at spending as if it's an art. In my opinion, you'll go bankrupt in this manner. If you continue to struggle by yourself, then it's a certainty. And I'll not help you even if you stand on your head. It should be pouring with orders for your excellent machines. Everyone does nothing now except look and copy. Mi addio, Fokker. Throughout his life, Antony would turn more to his mother for a sympathetic hearing. They remained very close right up until his death. The M2 finally brought the orders they thought they deserved. It was more refined and stable in the air than its predecessor, and could also be dismantled easily and transported by a specially converted Daimler truck. The German authorities were impressed and bought 10. Antony now considered himself a rich man. The following year, with the outbreak of war, future production would make any previous riches pale in comparison. It changed Fokker's position in world aviation forever. The day after war was declared, all his planes were requisitioned by the German forces, and new orders were placed in such quantity that his meager workforce was swamped. The early days of the war marked a period of intense experimentation and vast personal risk to those employed to test the prototypes. The first success was the M5. It was a light, durable, and highly maneuverable aircraft, making it lethal in a dogfight, and so beginning Fokker's formidable reputation for reliable and effective fighters. The M5 also produced Germany's flying ace, Max Immelmann, who described it as the nicest Christmas present in which I take childish delight. But apart from their planes, the German pilots had another major advantage, the synchronized machine gun. It was simple but brilliant. 2 days after being given the brief by German High Command to design it, Fokker, working together with 3 other technicians, designed a firing mechanism which was linked to the engine by means of a camshaft and lever, which meant bullets were only fired when there was no propeller blade in front of the barrel. The competing Allied designs invariably resulted in shattering propeller blades and injured or dead pilots. This destructive combination of agility and superior firepower further demoralized an already impotent Allied attack, and led to this statement in the British House of Commons by the independent Member of Parliament, Noel Pemberton Billing.
I do not intend to deal with the colossal blunders of the Royal Flying Corps, but I may refer to the hundreds, nay thousands of machines which they've ordered and which have been referred to by our pilots at the front as Fokker fodder. I don't want to touch a dramatic note this afternoon, but if I did, I would suggest that quite a number of our gallant officers in the RFC have been rather murdered than killed.
It wasn't until late in 1916 that the Allied forces introduced a similar machine, which had comparable maneuverability and firepower. As a consequence, Germany began to lose its advantage in the air, and to re-establish their former domination, they required a new aeroplane, one which had to be nothing short of revolutionary. A new chief designer, Reinhold Platz, a former welder of Spider fuselages as far back as 1912, was appointed, following the death of Martin Kreutzer, the man behind the M5 and numerous other Fokker designs of the early war years. Although he'd had no formal training of any sort, his first operational success was the DR-1, or Dreidecker, the triplane in which the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, made his reputation as the greatest flying ace of World War I. At this time, Antony, an irrepressible filmmaker, was recording what he found at the front line in northern France, where his designs had a devastating effect not only on Allied encampments, but also on the surrounding factories and towns. A certain degree of satisfaction was gained by his witnessing this almost blanket destruction. Although having faked unfitness to avoid being called up himself, Anthony Fokker always liked to share in the solidarity and camaraderie he found in the men to whom he supplied his aircraft. He would travel with them when a new design was being delivered to the front, as seen here with the DR-1, lording it over them all, officers and men alike, striding across the roof of the train or directing them to their places as they took part in his movies. Perhaps it's fair to say that he never found greater happiness in the rest of his life than he found here. For in the very heart of the horror of World War I, he found an arena where his own powerfully developed sense of individual excellence could find an alliance with the struggle of the many. This combination was formidable and found its most eloquent expression within the elite confines of von Richthofen's squadron. The DR-1 owes its fame more to the charismatic nature of Richthofen and the now almost mythical status in which he and his flying circus are held than to the intrinsic excellence of the aircraft itself. It was not in fact in service for long. Although the third wing enabled it to climb at a phenomenal rate, it also lacked the necessary speed because of it. Compromises also had to be made during building.
The military authorities wanted to have the triplane, which was basically a very good airplane. The military authorities wanted to have this type at the front as soon as possible.
After early successes, at the beginning of 1918, it was gradually phased out at the front line, and the German forces ordered another Fokker design as a replacement. This was the D-7, and in the remaining few months of the war, it would establish itself as the conflict's most successful fighter. So great, in fact, was its influence that it was the only aircraft specifically mentioned for immediate requisition by the Allied forces in the Armistice Agreement. Its life had begun less auspiciously. The prototype which Fokker himself had flown in tests had appalling stability and would spin at the slightest provocation. If he was to meet the required competition deadline, he could not instigate any major design changes. On the night before the competition, Fokker and his small team worked secretly, extending the fuselage and enlarging the rudder in a desperate attempt to make it more stable. The next morning, the aircraft was still very sensitive, but was at least airworthy. Each designer was asked to leave the airfield before their planes were tested. Fokker affected an air of casual disinterest, commenting to the pilots on his way out that his aeroplane was specifically designed with an ultra-fast reaction time, giving it a great advantage in the air during combat, and so to remember this when flying. With this hint, he had primed them for the dangers and made a virtue out of a fault. He was also saluting his own virtuosity, both as a pilot and a designer. Such an approach made him famous. It consisted of equal measures of bravado and an almost shameless sense for self-publicity. The effect the D-7 had over the Allies was devastating, but the so-called war to end all wars was largely won and lost on the ground. The aeroplane, as a fighting machine, would find its most complete and grotesque expression in the conflict of the next generation. The war ended, and during the chaos that followed, all aircraft in Germany were rounded up for demolition by the Allied forces. No machine, if it was found, was left intact. It wasn't only airplanes that were threatened with destruction. Germany's own pioneer aviators, Messerschmitt and Dornier, had to flee from the country for fear of their lives. Anthony Fokker also had to escape. With the help of friend Bernard de Waal, he slipped out of his besieged house disguised and crossed the border by train back to the Netherlands. The factory which produced over 3,500 aircraft during the war was dismantled immediately after his departure. In later years, Fokker wrote, "During my travels, I have heard much criticism because I tied my fate to that of the Germans. The Allies blamed me for not placing myself at the disposal of the Entente. These critics did not consider that my own country preferred French aeroplanes to mine, that England and Italy hardly bothered to respond, and that due to widespread corruption, I was unable to get started in Russia. Only Germany prepared a good reception for me, even if it wasn't entirely with open arms." Upon his return to the Netherlands, Fokker, his own effervescent son dimmed by the war, immediately set about reversing his fortunes. He established a new company, straight away acquiring an order for 46 D-7s and 61 C-1s placed by the Dutch military. The first major obstacle was the lack of available materials. With foresight, contingency plans had been made before his enforced departure from Germany. When an Allied victory seemed inevitable, Fokker had ordered the majority of the materials from his German factories to be hidden in cellars and barns all over the country, leaving just enough behind to satisfy the Allied demolition order. Secretly, using over 300 freight cars, 220 aircraft, 400 engines, and other assorted pieces of machinery were smuggled into the Netherlands over a period of 6 weeks. But the company's future now depended on something other than warplanes.
During the First World War, Fokker had built thousands of military aeroplanes, but the war being over, there was no requirement anymore for military aeroplanes. So somehow, Fokker had to switch over to civilian aeroplanes. And he, I think long before already, anticipated the requirement for what we now call airliners in the after-war period. There was no alternative.
The first result was the F-2. Then Fokker's associations began to catch up with him.
We have a copy of a letter from Plesman of KLM, who ordered some aeroplanes and said that his order would be cancelled if those Fokkers were not allowed to fly to England. And Plesman was here thinking about the, stigma Fokker had as builder of airplanes for the German authorities.
There was another problem. Reinhold Platz, Fokker's chief designer, was still living and working in Germany at this time. So after the plane was built, the problem was getting it out of Germany for exhibition elsewhere, since that country was still exercising stringent post-war export laws. Bernard de Waal came again to the rescue. He stole the plane, evading police and border guards and surviving numerous emergency landings. In 1921, the F-3 was unveiled. Its wider, shorter fuselage could carry 5 passengers in what looked like the recreation of a Victorian sitting room. It traded upon what had now become established Fokker characteristics. Easy assembly and quick repair, together with simple but sturdy materials, ensured that the F-3 was cost-effective as well as safe for an airline to run. Its exceptional stability, even in bad weather, meant that it kept on flying when all others were grounded. But it wasn't only KLM who bought them. They also flew in Germany, Russia, and Hungary, helping, by degrees, to reverse the reputation of Fokker from one of combat to that of civil aircraft. But the ghosts of the past couldn't be exorcised so easily or so quickly. Resentment and hatred were still present in some quarters, and with the F-3s at the Paris Air Show having to be protected from sabotage, Antony himself needed to be given a police guard. As had happened earlier with the F-2, the F-3 continued the popularization of mass air transport in Europe to such an extent that another, larger replacement was needed. What Plesman asked for, and what he received, would do more than popularize civil aviation. It would totally revolutionize it. In April 1924, the F-7 made its maiden flight to massive public acclaim. It was built with the aim of establishing a link between the Dutch East Indies and the Netherlands, and in the process became a bridge between Antony's own childhood in Java and his present-day life. What was almost too spectacular even to dream at the turn of the century was made reality in October 1924. The crew who made the trip, Van der Hoop, Van and Veerden Pullman and Van der Broek became heroes as great as Fokker had been himself after Haarlem. Their achievements in the eyes of the Dutch public seemed no less marvelous than those of Da Gama, Magellan and Columbus centuries before. Their feat was truly epic. It had brought the whole world within everyone's grasp, and KLM made sure that it was their name that was blazoned all over it. The trip was not without problems, but even these were turned into virtues. A near-fatal crash landing in Bulgaria gave the crew a chance to show how an aircraft almost written off could be repaired where it stood, only using the most basic of tools and materials. A whole new engine was fitted on the spot, and the undercarriage completely rebuilt. After the crash, they continued their flight, encountering no more significant problems, and arrived in the Dutch East Indies on November the 24th, nearly 2 months after their departure from Amsterdam. Their reception was rapturous. The expanse of the Dutch colonial empire could now be measured by machine. The United States had lagged behind Europe in developing a network of long-distance air travel, but by the mid-1920s, the intoxicating atmosphere which surrounded aviation and the improved economic situation inspired Henry Ford, the automobile magnate, to sponsor the Ford Reliability Tour and offered Fokker the chance to demonstrate his aircraft. He lived up to the reputation that the American press had given him. One journalist would dub it by the end the Fokker Publicity Tour. Anthony Fokker competed in an F-7, but was afraid that one engine wouldn't be sufficient. He cabled Platts back in the Netherlands to modify the design to accommodate 3 engines. The new tri-motor was complete within 8 weeks. It was dismantled, packed up, and followed Anthony across to New York. For Fokker, both the man and the company, the tour was a triumph. On each leg, he came in first, beating a whole range of other famous pilots and aircraft. To pass the time until the other competitors had landed, he would make trips with the press corps, such an opportunity being too good to miss. After the reliability tour, the same plane in the hands of Lieutenant Commander Richard Byrd made the first flight across the North Pole. In the sales contract, Fokker had stipulated that his company logo should be prominently displayed on the side of the plane, and Byrd may have been forgiven for thinking that his trip was yet another extravagant advertising exercise for the Dutchman. These successes in America led Anthony to move there himself, recording the trip, of course, with the movie camera. He recognized an environment conducive to his own vast talents for self-promotion and experimentation. In 1926, only 1 year after moving to the United States, the Fokker Atlantic Corporation was blossoming, with 8 dealers offering the Fokker Universal, his first aeroplane designed and built purely in America. In 1928, he described himself as climbing the ladder faster than his legs could carry him. His name maintained its high profile through the exploits of a succession of famous aviators such as Bertus Grasset, who held altitude and several speed records in Fokker aircraft. The millionaire businessman Van Leer Black was the first man to make a round trip from Amsterdam to Batavia in the Dutch East Indies, the whole trip taking only 4 weeks. It also became the first intercontinental charter flight in the world. The Dutch military aviator, Lieutenant Koppen, set a new record for the journey a few months afterwards. Carrying mail only, it took less than 3 weeks. Then, the Australian Charles Kingsford Smith became the first man to cross the Pacific from America to Australia in a tri-motor called the Southern Cross. By the late 20s, with Anthony not yet 40 years old, the Fokker Atlantic Corporation had become the biggest aircraft producer in the world. Imagination was boundless. Nothing seemed impossible. Without realizing it, Anthony had now reached the pinnacle of his success. He could climb the ladder no further. Personal tragedy mirrored the upheavals of the early 30s. Antony's second wife, Violet Fokker Eastman, died in a mysterious fall from the second-floor window of their apartment. A verdict of suicide was recorded, but doubt persists to this day about the actual cause. Bertus Grasse also died at the turn of the decade, and von Leer Black, who had flown all over the world from Tokyo to Nassau. The phenomenal success of the company meant that other, larger American companies laid siege to it, hoping to buy into the miracle. The eventual victors were General Motors, who bought 40% of the shares, becoming the major stockholder. Antony's own power base within the company receded. Back in Europe, the situation was also changing. Reinhold Platz, Fokker's premier designer, left the company, creating a giant void. But the legacy of his achievements helped the company through the difficult Depression years. Still, out of the 17 European countries, the airlines of 13 operated Fokker aircraft, and 17 factories manufactured them under license. In 1934, a new plane was unveiled. The F-36 was made with the intention of replacing the now outmoded F-7 on the long-haul journeys. But it was hopelessly outdated before it had even left the ground. The reason? The Douglas DC series, with its revolutionary all-metal construction. It showed the way ahead and pointed to the lack of foresight the Fokker company had shown in persisting with their steel tube, wood and linen design. These techniques, which had evolved out of the First World War, made the largest aeroplane ever built in the Netherlands seem like a dinosaur in comparison to the twin-engined, streamlined, all-metal design with its retractable undercarriage, brake flaps, and variable pitch propellers. Plessman was loath to sever his links with Fokker, the company with whom he'd had so much success. In the face of such competition, his interest in buying the F-36 waned, and he chose the Douglas. Typically, Antony Fokker surprised everyone by swallowing his pride and buying the license to manufacture them in Europe. The massive losses incurred by the failure of the F-36 necessitated it. His own company couldn't afford the change to all metal, and it saddened him to see the American pioneers pass him by when his own name no longer existed in that country. Dutch national pride was palpable when, in 1933, 20,000 people showed their delight by cramming Schiphol in the early hours of a cold winter morning to welcome back an F-18 plane called Pelican. It had fought through fog to set a new record for the return flight from Amsterdam to Batavia, after the gauntlet had been thrown down by the rival Dutch company, Panda. The return trip was now possible within 8 days. Each crew member was made a knight upon their return. History repeated itself. As in 1914, when the First World War gave the young company its chance to establish itself in the international arena, the preparations for the Second Great War gave the ailing giant a chance to reverse its fortunes and to become once more a major force in world aviation. Two designs were instrumental in this turnaround: the D-21, Fokker's first monoplane fighter, and the G-1, a fighter bomber and reconnaissance airplane. Both were still of composite construction, which Plessman now referred to dismissively as paper aeroplanes. In 1936, the Paris Air Show proved Plessman's judgment to be inaccurate when the G-1 became a sensation. With its twin tail booms and formidable armory, which included 8 machine guns in the nose cone, it was as revolutionary as the D-7 had been 20 years earlier. The visionary, pioneering spirit had been recaptured, leading the Sunday Express in Britain to write, "The entire aviation world has seen its ideas have to be changed. Antony Fokker's latest warplane is responsible. For the second time, the Dutchman has changed military ideas."
It had not one specific purpose, like for instance the Spitfire, who is purely built as a fighter. This aircraft had a multitude of roles to play. It could be used as a bomber, it could be used for reconnaissance, it could be used as a fighter. It was pretty fast, very strongly built,
It would claim many victories over invading German Messerschmitts in the spring offensive of 1940. But later, the complete domination of any propaganda harmful to the Nazis ensured that this film is now the only record left of a G-1 on combat duty. It possessed formidable speed and climbing power, making it perfect for attacking bombers. So much so that it soon acquired the nickname the Reaper. Anthony Fokker himself lived long enough to see the resurrection of his Dutch company and to see it lead the world again. Never a man to dwell on the past, his excitement and pride was obvious after the misery of the 1930s. He also lived to see the war begin in Europe and his aeroplanes fight the so-called Winter War in Finland, where the D-21 and other biplane designs, such as the C-10 and C-5, were in active service. When considered against the massive personal risks he had taken in testing so many of his early prototypes, it seems almost absurd that 2 days before Christmas 1939, he died from meningitis, contracted after a minor nose operation. The new age of aviation was a very different one from the breathless excitement of the 1920s. Following his death, the corporation took precedence over the individual, a taste of which Anthony experienced with General Motors. His position within such a situation, had he lived, can only be guessed at, but his death marks the end of the first generation of aviation. The Dutch factory continued under the guidance of Van Tyen, an aviation hero of the 1920s, famous for his single-handed flights to Japan and Batavia. Such memories were forgotten as he prepared his men and the factory for their most severe test. The conquest of the Low Countries by Nazism was irresistible. The Dutch air and land forces fought to retain sovereignty of their country, and Fokker aircraft were a major part of their defenses. But the German war machine was simply too big. Although resistance was intense, the Netherlands were overrun in just 4 days. The Fokker factory in Amsterdam was occupied immediately by the Nazis, who set about replacing all the old management with their own staff. Wilhelm Seekatz, a German friend of Anthony Fokker's and his finest salesman from happier days in the 1920s, was appointed head of the factory, replacing his old friend Van Tyen, who had been arrested and sent to Buchenwald on suspicion of collaboration with the Allies. Such cooperation had, in fact, been widespread among the Fokker employees. They smuggled out information through the underground concerning the whereabouts of the now disguised factory. They were putting their own lives at risk, not only with the Nazis, but also with the Allies, who pounded Amsterdam's industrial quarter mercilessly. The aerial bombardment, and in particular the use of fragmentation bombs, did a great deal of damage to a factory now devoted wholly to producing or repairing German war aircraft. Passive resistance was used to slow the rate of production, so even though the numbers of employees had swelled from 1,500 to 5,500, the drop in production was drastic. Because of this, 6 employees were selected and shot. The extreme damage inflicted by the Allied bombers eventually brought work to a standstill, and subsequently the factory was decentralized and spread over 40 different sites around the Netherlands. On the 5th of September 1944, the occupying Nazi forces finally gave up their war of attrition with the Dutch and fled the country. At Fokker, they carried back with them as many tools as they could, stripping bare the factory. Naturally, the joy of liberation was intoxicating after the Nazis had left. Solidarity among the employees had reached such a pitch during the war years that many offered, if necessary, to work for free, so that they could have their factory back. Reconstruction began with Van Tyen being found alive in Buchenwald. The Dutch people were exhausted, but not so tired that they didn't want to believe the legend on the float. Holland once again, a nation of aviation. Joe Cornelis, then a young aerodynamicist, recalls those days.
When it finally started converting the quotas, everybody felt again back in the aviation. And it took until, I think, 1940, end of 46, that we had our own airplane again. The S-11, which was built for the Dutch Air Force to begin with, as a trainer, really caught on.
The need was for a trainer suitable for both military and civil use, but with pre-war designs outdated and a wartime design staff controlled by the Nazis, the Fokker firm was forced to start from scratch. By the end of 1946, there were already 6 designs in hand. The S-11 was the first of these to go into production. Its side-by-side seating with third passenger option, plus a very low stalling speed, ensured worldwide popularity. Brazil, Israel, and Italy were amongst the governments who purchased it, some of whom manufactured it under license. This flight of the first prototype became a dance of joy for each employee. The first and most critical stage of reconstruction was over. Thoughts now began to run to other, more ambitious projects.
S-14 was the first jet aircraft built in Holland, designed according to a specification from a mighty military body, NATO. Fokker realized with the S-14, which was a successful trainer, which met the specification, but was never bought by any Air Force except the Dutch. That's a small Air Force, too small to warrant serious production of, let's say, trainers or fighters or bombers. And the decision was a dramatic and traumatic decision for many people at Fokker in those days, not to design military airplanes anymore.
The failure of the S-14 produced an aggressive counter-reaction at Fokker. More than ever now, they wanted to regain their position in commercial aviation. Historical symmetry worked in their favor again. The DC series, which had superseded the F-7 as the world's leading passenger aircraft, was now in need of being replaced itself. In 1955, Fokker wheeled from the hangar its answer.
In those days, we had a chief designer by the name of Van Meerten, Kees Van Meerten, and he was obsessed about the idea to continue the line of civil aircraft that Fokker had to leave just before the war. He actually fathered the whole design effort and, to a large extent, also the activities in the market.
The F-27 Friendship was the world's first twin turboprop airliner and the first Fokker airliner to appear for 20 years. The market research which Van Meerten had investigated 5 years earlier in 1950 showed the Rolls-Royce Dart engine as the finest available, capable of sustaining flight even after major power loss. Other characteristics considered were a high wing configuration to facilitate easier ground loading, giving passengers an uninterrupted ground view. A new metal bonding technique developed in Britain meant rivets could be dispensed with over large surface areas. The F-27 has proved this method not only aerodynamically cleaner, but also much stronger and more durable. Other manufacturers soon followed suit.
We were all surprised by the success. We based the calculations for the economic calculations on a break-even point around 70 aircraft. After we had sold 200 or so, somebody said, we are going to sell 500 of this. And that was said in some meeting, some celebration, and there was, of course, this bet taken how many it would be. They all lost. The highest bid was 600 or something. It's nearly 800. 784, I think, is the right number.
The F-27 ensured a decade of prosperity for Fokker and became the springboard for their next success, the F-28, the company's first pure jet commercial aircraft. It was rolled out in the spring of 1967. Designed specifically to deal with a range of hostile climatic and territorial conditions, the stress put on the airframe is extreme, and the knowledge used to cope with these particular problems was gathered from a wide range of sources. Help in design and production came from two companies in West Germany and Short Brothers and Harland in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Such a combination would precede the European Airbus cooperation of the 1970s and 80s, where Fokker played a major part, not surprisingly, in market research. These two designs are now reaching the end of their active lives, and already new designs exist to continue their success. Franz Swarthout, chairman of Fokker, talks of the future.
The Fokker 50 is derivative of the F-27, so is the Fokker 100 a derivative of the F-28, though there's a big difference between the two projects. The Fokker 50 is aiming at being a replacement of the F-27. The Fokker 100 penetrates into another market segment. As we call it, the Fokker 100 is the biggest aircraft for the small airlines and the smallest aircraft for the biggest airlines. The unique thing about Fokker is not just technology, it's the market-orientated attitude. It's going back to the old trading traditions of our country. We have always been a trading nation. We are strongly market-orientated, and there is a strong interface between design technology on one side and marketing on the other side, which I think is the essence of entrepreneurship.
The terminology may have changed, but the desire remains the same as it was when Anthony Fokker, back in 1911, set out on his path with a dream of flight, naive optimism, and an unshakable belief in his own genius, and his right to claim the skies of the world for himself.